Controllers are awesome, and since it's finally getting to be the summertime once again, I'm more pumped than ever to make some new content. But to celebrate my full-time switch to shorter form videos, a change I thought long and hard about, I wanted to begin the season by discussing the amazing world of controllers. Now, I have no shortage of controllers I could go through here, but I figured let's just cover some of the most notable ones that have withstood the test of time. A controller is one of the most vital parts of playing a video game, behind the game and the console of course. But despite their rather simple looking exteriors in most cases, the act of creating an actual good controller isn't as easy as it sounds. Let's start this off by taking a look at what a seriously bad controller looks like. Take this piece of trash. And yes, this is actually a real thing. This controller, strangely named Applejack, was originally meant to be paired with Apple's Pippin home console, a console that was supposed to be released in 1997, but got long discontinued before it actually ever came out. And this thing had probably the single worst controller design I have ever seen. I mean, just look at it. What could possibly be good about such a contraption? The buttons are spread out too far, the D-pad joystick thingy barely looks functional, and what is that supposed to be in the middle? A trackpad? Anyways, this should act as the prime example of just how bad controller design can truly get. And I know, this is a pretty extreme example. So, okay, let's scale it down a bit and take a look at a much more familiar controller to the most of us, the GameCube controller. These are two GameCube controllers. Pretty cool, right? But if you had to take a guess, what would you say the price difference is between these two pieces of hardware? If you said $300, you'd be correct. The key difference between the two, besides their appearance of course, is that the one on the left is just the regular, stock GameCube controller, while the one on the right has been completely custom made, face buttons and all. But what did the GameCube controller manage to do so correctly that allows them to be sold at such a premium in the first place? For starters, it's actually been considered one of the greatest controllers ever manufactured for many years now, and was arguably one of the most influential controller designs we've ever seen as well. Its comfortable shape, amazing face buttons, great control sticks, although not the most consistent, and insane durability were pretty one of a kind when they first came out. Even the newest Xbox controllers bear a striking resemblance to the GameCube's philosophy, and for good reason as well. While it isn't perfect by any means, the controller design they went with all those years ago was certainly one ahead of its time, and still shows its colors even 20 years down the line. Now I may be a bit biased with this one because this is probably my favorite controller of all time, but even if we look at it from an objective lens, this was still a really great controller with all due respect. Now let's take it back a bit further and take a look at Nintendo's previous design they went with, the Nintendo 64 controller. When holding this next to the GameCube controller, we can see that they're completely different in basically every way, which starts to make a lot more sense when you realize that this controller's quality in particular has been pretty controversial since it first came out. It's still an ongoing debate if Nintendo 64 controllers are actually good or not, with some swearing by the fact that it's one of the best, and others viewing it as uncomfortable, clunky, and just poorly designed for playing video games. Despite the rather uncertain outlooks, this controller was the first to introduce the Z button, and while the addition of just one single button may seem rather small, it was able to open a gateway to all sorts of new control schemes to be tested out. And with video game controls getting slowly but surely more complex around this time, this was a no-brainer for encouraging a smoother playing experience. Now, unlike the GameCube controllers, however, the N64 control sticks were notoriously not the best, with some players reporting noticeable malfunctioning in them after less than a year of moderate playtime. They were actually calibrated pretty well out of the box, but the issue came with how they would age. If treated uncarefully, the stick would start to feel rigid and gritty, could accumulate dust and dirt like no other, and could be a serious pain to try and fix if it happened to break. It's so bad, in fact, that players have straight up started encouraging each other to just swap them out for GameCube control sticks if they could manage to do it. Even most speedrunners of Nintendo 64 games don't even use the stock controllers anymore, and have opted instead for a much cleaner second-party controller known as Hori, which was a Japanese exclusive controller released much later in the N64's lifespan. So now that we've looked at some controllers of the past, what are controllers looking like these days? Of course we have the DualShocks, of course we have the conventional Xbox controllers, but those are boring. So let's take a closer look at more of those custom controllers I brought up earlier. I already showed off a custom GameCube controller, which has a neat aesthetic to it, and the same can be applied to even the newest iterations of controllers as well. But there's actually quite a few purposes for acquiring this sort of thing if you're a gamer. For one, Custom controllers are usually hot swappable, which means you can take the parts in and out of the controller a lot easier than before. The benefit to hot swapping is that it allows you to keep the parts of your controller that are still functioning and only requires you to buy replacement parts for what needs to be fixed, helping cut down on the general cost of replacement as well as to help the controller last a lot better long term. They also come with these cool looking paddles on the back, which are used to remap buttons of your choice to make certain actions in game a lot easier to pull off, and also to reduce hand strain during prolonged periods of play. The last thing to note is that the sticks and D-pads are actually magnetic, and the upside of having magnetized sticks opposed to not is that they're able to read player inputs a lot faster and more smoothly, and are completely insusceptible to developing stick drift, on top of just being the most durable kind of control stick by far. To be fair, most of the changes I just mentioned are mostly revolved around quality of life improvements and not a whole lot else, so they aren't entirely necessary by any means. But sometimes they just look cool anyways, so people will buy it because of that alone. Take this controller for instance, which has an all-white appearance with gold face buttons, gold bumpers, and lightning bolts along the sides to top it off. Or check this one out, which kind of reminds me of the Asimov camo from Counter-Strike. Oh, and you can't forget about this one, which has the Joker on it. Yeah, we get it. Custom controllers aren't the only difference in design we get to see today, though. The Nintendo Switch opted to have much smaller gamepads called Joy-Cons, which, well, didn't have the best reception depending on who you asked. For being so new, though, they sure don't showcase a philosophy that many other game companies should take inspiration from. For one, they're tiny and are a nightmare to hold for any prolonged period of time. But not only were they physically small, the cost of these things is through the roof as well, usually starting at around $40 per Joy-Con, which isn't a very inviting price to most people. But to wrap things up here, let's quickly go down the list of a couple things that objectively create a good controller. You know, for the future's sake if things ever start to get crazy again. Without a doubt, the most obvious aspect of a good controller is button and control stick accessibility. Looking at the Nintendo 64 controller once again, another reason that controller found itself in a bit of heat was that the D-pad in particular was in an atrocious spot, forcing you to completely remove your thumb from the control stick to move up and then start hitting the D-pad, which was simply just poor design choice. Something else to consider when putting together a controller is its physical size and shape. A controller needs to be accessible to players with both larger and smaller hands, and needs to be able to rest comfortably for most people, which I can only imagine is pretty tricky to find the sweet spot with. And honestly, meet those two criteria and you should have yourself a pretty solid blueprint for a good controller design. That's really all that it takes, aside from the obvious factors like button quality and such. Of course, it's pretty unreasonable to expect or to even call any controller a perfect controller, but the title sounds pretty cool, I must admit. And the effort of reaching as close as we can to one day creating the perfect controller is certainly something to be praiseful about. Who prefers which controller these days will always be a bit of a toss-up, but that's only natural when there's so many options to choose from, and that's perfectly okay. Whether you prefer a real classic Nintendo controller, a GameCube controller, or anything before and after that, it should be entirely clear that the goal of one day finding the perfect controller is reaching ever so closer. And that's all, folks. For now, at least.